I bet you thought we were done with the sides. Nope, we need one more before we move on. This one's a JavaScript aside. It's a really important concept called the global namespace. So what do we mean by the global namespace? Well, I'm going to go back to this little Hello World web page, and I'm going to run it. And when it runs, and the browser loads it and paints it to the screen, I now have a piece of memory on my computer that's dedicated to this web page where I can put my JavaScript objects and the variables and do things. So if I create a variable, let's say person, and I'm going to call it Tony, just a string. And then I'm going to output it to the console. So there it is, Tony. Now I've stuck this variable in the global namespace. It's up at the top of the memory, if you want to think about it that way. Now this is a problem in real world scenarios. For example, let's suppose I have some other code, somebody else's code. Maybe it's a utility that I found on the internet, or some code somebody gave to me, or even something I wrote a long time ago. In real world scenarios, we do that a lot. So let's suppose I had some utility.js file, and in it, let's say a guy named Steve wrote it. And what I don't know is that Steve called his variable person. The functionality that I was looking for, let's say, was some log person function, and I just wanted to use his code. So it goes ahead and logs person. So Steve thought this was a great little thing that he built, and I come along and I use his code and I call it log person. I call log person from his code. What do you think you're going to see? It's still Tony. Why? Because by the time I call this function, the variable person has been overwritten by my version of it. See, they're both sitting in the global namespace. So there's a variable called person, and when I declared a variable called person, I overrode the original. And so when this function got called, Tony is what was sitting as a value in memory, not Steve. This can cause some terrible situations and some really hard to find bugs. If Steve, who's creating a reusable piece of code, was smart, he'd make some kind of namespace or container for everything that he was writing so that you didn't have that pollution. There's a few ways to do that, but I'll just do it the simplest way. I'm just going to create an empty object. That's just JSON notation for an empty object, and I'll then start putting things inside that object. So I'm going to create a function called logPerson inside the Steve's app object, and it's going to log the value of person inside Steve's app. So now when I call logPerson, well, first this won't work because now it's not in the global namespace, this function. It is underneath Steve's app. Now I can call Steve's app.logPerson, and I see Steve. See that? My variable didn't override the global namespace variable of this because it's not in the global namespace, it's inside an object. If I did want to update that person value, I could then go Steve's app.person equals my person. This one, sitting in the global namespace. And now I should see Tony. So encapsulation, making sure that we're not polluting the global namespace, is a very important aspect of building extensible, reusable, and complex software. So AngularJS makes this a fundamental part of its structure. When you build an AngularJS app, you're going to see that there are certain elements and structural concepts that have the goal of not polluting the global namespace, making sure that variables and functions that are defined don't collide and contradict variables and functions defined elsewhere. And that allows for a nice big ecosystem of really cool code that we don't have to worry about is going to interfere with other code without realizing it. That's the global namespace. That's this JavaScript aside.